Welcome back to the Futurists. I am in the hosting chair solo this week because Rob is on the road. But we have a really interesting guest coming to you today, all the way from South Africa. And that is Adrian Saville. He's the founder of Boundless World and professor of the Gordon Institute of Business Science. He's a futurist. He's an economist. Adrian, welcome to the Futurists.
Thank you, Brett. Great to be with you.
Which part of SA are you coming to us from?
I'm in Johannesburg, and as we're speaking, beautiful sunny afternoon as we head into spring.
Yeah, Joburg has some, well, Cape Town as well, has some spectacular days. So
I think this has to rank as some of the best weather in the world.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Well, I'm in Bangkok. It gets a little bit hot here, but still the weather's pretty it's nice. I lived in the cold, biomes. I lived in Connecticut, and I had snow, 6 inches of snow on the ground and stuff like that, So but that was interesting, but personally I prefer warmer climates, and obviously South Africa is very temperate. Okay, so I want to just jump straight into the conversation. You obviously do a ton of work in terms of economic policy and insights for South Africa and the Pan-African region. But why don't we start with Boundless, which is this, it's really an economics consultancy, as I understand it, but data back. Tell me about what you're building there.
So Boundless is my baby, business that I started to essentially help companies, decision makers wrestle with a couple of big questions that really matter to the future of any business. And the first is the question of internationalization. Should we go? So many companies take it as a given that growth for the sake of growth is a sensible pursuit. So that really starts with a deep philosophical interrogation of why are we internationalizing, the purpose behind internationalization, and then more pragmatic considerations. Where do we go? With particular Pan-African focus, we're talking about, depending on who you ask, 54, 55, or 56 countries. That range all the way from the tiny economies of Eswatini or Lesotho through to jumbo jet-sized economies of Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia are good examples of the bigger economies. And then the final consideration is helping businesses develop models that are fit for purpose. One of the greatest, I think, sins of strategic thinking in internationalization, Pan-Africa, is that Africa is a place, which could hardly be further from the truth.
Yeah. It's one of those old tropes, right? It's just like, like when Americans, are you going to Africa? Yeah. Which, like, it's like it's a city almost, not even a country, but, and certainly not a continent. But here's an interesting, so, we have talked about projections of Nigeria being one of the, top 5, 10 economies in the world in the 2060s, for example. But the amount of investment that's going into Africa right now, particularly Chinese investment alone, how is that changing the economic makeup of the continent?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating aspect because, whilst the potential, the prospect is absolutely massive, in order to manifest that and realize that, it requires a huge input, which is, as you point out, the capital required, infrastructure in particular. And, the numbers for Africa as a collective to achieve rail infrastructure with the same density as India or China requires an investment of about $100 billion per annum.
That's a lot of money, 100 billion.
It's a lot of money, and these numbers are,
we're talking Elon Musk money there.
We are talking Elon Musk money. In fact, that might be a bit of a task for him But
Yeah.
not only are these numbers big, they're a long way away from what's going in at the moment. So there's this incredible opportunity.
Okay.
There's the big ask and the deficit.
So how does Africa attract more investment to build this possible future? I mean, let's talk about, if we're talking about where we can start with sustainable infrastructure,
Yeah,
Africa as a continent is a great place for that because a lot of it is greenfield, and so we
sure.
don't have to put old coal plants and things like that in. If we're going to expand on energy infrastructure, for example. It's all going to be next generation technology. So why aren't we using that as a proving ground? That's my first thought. But
Well, I think, at least two reasons. The first is it remains the case that Africa is overwhelmingly misunderstood. It's under-researched, it's unknown. Jonathan Swift, the Irish poet, a couple of hundred years ago, quipped that when geographers didn't know what was, there, if they didn't know that there were towns, they just put sort of elephants. Um, so you've got these very large knowledge, information, and data gaps. To be fair, it's not just about ignorance; it's that the data don't
yeah,
exist. But then, as you point out, a blessing and upside is that a lot of the infrastructure, has never been there, and so it's not that you have to uproot or uh, uh, uninstall. You've got this greenfields and photovoltaic irradiation. If you're going to build renewable energy anywhere in the world,
yeah. All right,
um,
exactly.
Africa offers
Right.
you some of the
Was
best
it a hundred square kilometer grid in Sahara would power entire of continental Europe? I think I've seen that as a step before. If you're listening to
haven't
that
heard
and,
that
and
stat.
that's
I'll go with
incorrect,
it.
then please forgive me and feel free to correct me on social media. But I'm pretty sure that's in the
Mm,
ballpark. You know.
yeah,
So that, I mean, but obviously, we've seen digital money emerge in Africa in many respects.
yeah.
Certainly the payments platforms, M-Pesa, MTN Money, stuff like that. There's some pretty interesting innovation going on. Not only that, but if you look at the unicorns that are coming out of sort of Africa as a continent, then most of the businesses that are emerging as big, you know, what we would traditionally call e-commerce plays are actually mobile commerce players, right? Because it's like
Yeah.
Africa sort of skipped that whole e-commerce, internet thing and sort of gone straight to mobile because of the emerging mobile infrastructure. Same with mobile money, right?
Mm. So let's go back to your reference to Nigeria. If you go to Nigeria, late 1990s, early 2000s, a population at the time of 170, 180 million, with 1 million landlines installed. Nigeria today is a
Yeah, yeah.
population of just over 200 million,
I know,
with more
crazy.
than 200 million mobile lines installed.
Yeah. No, it's the same for, like, if you look at mobile money, like at KCB, in Kenya, they had 2 million
Mm, mm.
customers, right? A
Yeah.
120-year-old bank. What's the population of Kenya these days? Like,
Uh, 40 million, I think.
yeah,
You asked
something
you
like that.
on the spot. You're putting me there. Yeah.
No, that's all right, dude. Yeah, we can edit it if it's wrong. Not really. I'm just gonna look it up actually while we're talking. But you've got then M-Pesa's come along, 54 million. So you're talking about the adult population, obviously. Um, but if you look at how they develop that sort of mobile money tech and so forth, and then you look at financial inclusion, what's happened to financial inclusion, it's completely, it's like thrown the model on its head there. And so then you have
Yeah.
these banks being forced to work with platforms like M-Pesa to attract these new customers. And in reality, it was the only way you could do it at scale economically. You couldn't have done it with branches. So, but I'm going
No,
off
the
into my
point.
fintech thing, but you get the
Yeah.
idea.
Look, I mean, I think it's worth staying there for a second because um, if you cast your mind back 10, 15 years, the banks essentially said from a retail perspective, the bulk of Africa's population was unbankable.
Right.
And you've seen telcos leapfrog this unbankability and achieve a huge element of financial inclusion using mobile, as you're pointing out. the similar thing is happening right now, I would venture, with businesses, that the banks and the telcos are now suggesting that businesses in Africa are overwhelmingly unbankable because they're small, maybe micro, but maybe even nano enterprises. And the suggestion is,
Right. But if you
these
can get
banks
them
are
on some
unbankable.
sort of platform, right?
Exactly.
Look at what
Exactly.
Alibaba's done in, like
Yeah.
Alibaba now is 40% of the SME lending market in China. That's
Yeah.
insane, right? Well, through Alipay and
Yeah.
my bank, but merchant funding, over 50 million businesses a year. And that's if you're going to invest in next gen infrastructure in Africa, where are you going to do it? You can invest in infrastructure, but if you're going to invest in companies, you're going to be investing in brands that can scale across Africa, and
Yeah.
that takes sort of that unique African perspective as you've been talking about, because it's not as easy as it sounds. It's not like doing it in the EU, right? Even when there is language differences and so forth.
Exactly.
Obviously, you've got very big differences in economics and core infrastructure that can support the growth of companies. Yeah, obviously. Yeah. Sorry, I'm I'm
No,
going off
I
on
mean,
tangents here.
I'll go with you. And we so an estimate that's footballed around is that there are as many as 84 million um, medium, small, micro enterprises in Africa. That is
Yeah.
a massive business population to bank.
Yeah.
But then, as you're pointing out, there are all of these differences, industrial differences, climate differences, geographic differences, cultural differences, regulatory differences.
Yeah, absolutely. So South Africa's obviously from a regulatory perspective, a little bit further advanced than some of the other jurisdictions. Although, we look at economies like Kenya and Nigeria and Ghana and Ethiopia and Egypt. Obviously, they're pretty complex, economies and fairly well managed these days. But sort of moving beyond that over the next few years, you also have you still have good sustainable birth rates. You still
Yeah.
have very good access to farmland and agriculture, and food security is going to be less of a problem in Africa than it might be in other parts of the world. But on the AI front, it's going to be really interesting to see how AI sort of comes in on that. And I know you're big on the AI front. So talk about where you see AI fitting in the African story, the continent
Yeah.
story.
So, but my body language has gone bad here. Um, you've made me cross. You've made
It's
me
all right.
cross my arms. um, there's a big infrastructural deficit. That when you reference infrastructure first,
Right.
it was obvious to assume that we're talking about rail, road, harbors, airports, etc. Maybe even telco. But
Yeah.
there is a massive
Like look
infrastructure
look at look at
deficit.
look at the look at the villages in Kenya and Nigeria and places like that. How do we get them
Mm.
solar and digital tech?
Yeah, well, there's not only, is there a very large deficit in infrastructure generally, there is a specific deficit in the infrastructure of data connectivity. Data
Right.
is expensive, it's slow, it's unreliable. And you could point to the continent broadly speaking, as this being generic, as a general condition for all of Africa. Um, uh, so, this is a further aspect that requires massive infrastructure investment.
Yeah. No, I would agree with you. And that's why, I find it interesting, China's approach to some of these economies, at least. And,
Yeah,
there's been a
and
lot of criticism in the West of this. But the fact is, I mean, China's doing this strategically to ensure that they continue to influence, Africa from an economic perspective. And they have access to African farmland and ports and so forth for feeding the Chinese if, food scarcity becomes an issue. I see it as very strategic.
I'm not
And I see,
sure, how. Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
But I'm not sure how far you want to go into geopolitical water on
Let's
this.
just dive in, dude. Yeah, whatever's interesting.
But I would venture that on this score, the global superpowers historically, both Europe and the United States, have been asleep at the wheel,
Mm.
and that the Chinese have stolen a march in this
I
regard.
think you're absolutely bang on. I think that's a really accurate assessment. So, and you know what? Like this is also 21st century economics at play. Like this sort of reformation.
Absolutely.
If like if you want to talk about where Africa is going to get incredible amounts of investment in the future, you could talk about the experience economy, meaning economy, and all of those sorts of things. Like obviously coming to Kruger National Park and these sorts of things. But if you want to talk about like 21st century economics, China's setting up all of these ports and roads and so forth, not just to support trade with China, but to support autonomous trade with China. You know, highly sophisticated ports, a lot of tech in them. Same for the airports, things like that. You go there now, and it's like there's new terminals going up everywhere across Africa at airports, and you hear the Chinese English, Chinese and English and local language announcements and things like that. It's really interesting to see how it's sort of reshaping the potential of the
Yeah,
continent.
think of the appetite to invest. We might be overplaying this infrastructure point, but
Sorry, yeah,
no, 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 no. Standing behind my work is a model. Perhaps we have a moment to talk about it. It's called the six-factor model, where using
sure,
big data, we identify the key ingredients that drive sustained, elevated, inclusive economic growth. This path to prosperity. There is not a country that has transformed or transitioned without that savings investment architecture as the underpin. So this really underlines the point of the importance of finding the capital, finding the funders and providers of this capital that support that infrastructure. And if we look at the United States, if we look at Europe, these are two places that have been in infrastructure droughts.
yeah.
They really need to
Yeah.
invest in their own infrastructure before,
Yeah, like
venturing
the
further
US for
afield.
sure, man. Yeah, I lived in New
Yeah.
York. The bridges and the roads and stuff, where but it's hard to get investment in those spaces, even as you say, even within the States.
Yeah, and then you take the experience of India, as a counter or a comparator. Lovely stat. India over the last decade has built 9 new airports a year. Um,
Yeah, that's a big stat. I mean, I know China's done like, what is it, 50,000 kilometers of fast rail track, but India, we have to understand India, like you go to places like Mysore, and you see the was it Finnical or whatever their campus. It's just incredible,
yeah,
architecture and so forth there, and obviously Bangalore and so forth, Chennai, Madras area, getting some really strategic investments over the last few years because of their technology industry. It's
this reshapes the world.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. All right, well, we got to go to break, but before we go to break, we like to do a little thing that our with our guests where we basically ask you a few quick fire questions. All right, let's do now what we call the quick fire or lightning round. All right, so is there any particular science fiction you remember being exposed to on TV or via books, Adrian?
Arthur C. Clarke.
Great answer. What technology do you think has most changed humanity?
The washing machine or the microwave oven.
Okay, cool. And is there a futurist or entrepreneur that has particularly influenced you, and why?
Probably Hans Rosling, although he's late. Hans
Yes,
Rosling and thinking about the long structural drivers and the way the world is changing.
I
I would
love the
argue
way he thinks about
very
data, or the
influential.
way he thought about data.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed.
If you're listening to this, go and check out Hans Rosling, some of Hans Rosling's TED Talks. They're masterpieces. All right. And finally, is there a science fiction story that is most representative of the future that you hope for?
Wow. That really puts me on a spot.
If no,
Oh,
if there's nothing, then that's
no,
fine. But
I would go to one of the Jules Verne
mm,
uh, stories where there are elements of dystopia, but if we could get things right, imagine what is possible. So the functional and positive features of Jules Verne, I'll go with
okay,
those.
I love it. All right, great. All right, you're listening to The Futurists. We are with Adrian Saville, a futurist from South Africa, and we'll be back in a moment. Well, welcome back. So I'm your host, Brett King, and we are in the virtual studio today with Dr. Adrian Saville. He is the founder of Boundless World. He's a professor of the Gordon Institute of Business and Business Science, where he teaches. He's a professor, has a professorship in economics, finance, and strategy. And he's also the founding director of GIBS's Center for African Management and Markets. So, Adrian, we had a really interesting conversation about sort of the Pan-African requirements, but the benefits and opportunities there economically. But let's talk about Boundless specifically. Why did you set up this? I mean, we talked a bit before the business, but what's your objective here? Where do you want to take Boundless, over the next few years, and how do you feel it can help Africa?
Without question, Brett, I think that we, find ourselves resident in or maybe I should say one of the most exciting parts of the world, because I'd put three up there on the Olympic podium: Asia, Latin America, and Africa. And you can choose whether you award them gold, silver, or bronze. But without question, this is one of the most dynamic regions. Fast forward to 2050, and we've got the world's largest workforce, the world's youngest population, abundant
Yeah,
resources, and the real work of
and
Boundless
hopefully
World
wildlife
is
still.
there's plenty of land.
Yeah,
Some of the most important work that Boundless does is help businesses fill information and knowledge gaps. That there are huge veils of ignorance regarding Africa, and then that is to add insult to the injury. You've got massive information and data voids. So helping businesses understand the nature of the beast is a critical part of the work that we do in this fast-growing, fast-changing environment, and building business models that are fit for purpose.
yeah. No, I think that's really important. That fit. Um, let's change tack a little bit now. Before the break, we didn't really get into the conversation, but when we talk about AI being disruptive, because I know
Mm.
you've written on this as well, where do you see AI being the most disruptive on the continent?
I think there's a couple of industries that it's have already been leapfrogged. I'm mentioning the work that Boundless is doing with business models, but I think that there's a couple of industries where this leapfrogging has already happened. Yet many of the incumbents are asleep at the wheel.
Can you give us
Arguably,
those illustrations? Yeah.
yeah, so I would
Mhm.
argue that banking is probably the most
Yep.
obvious.
Yep.
Where I'm resident, I have investments in two investment management firms. And I think that landscape has changed spectacularly, although that is a very small industry
Yes.
in an African setting. Banking is a much bigger and potentially a vast, expansive industry where the historical models, the models of the last 20, 30, 50, 100 years simply don't resonate.
Yeah.
Healthcare, I would argue also, is a really important one where biotech is probably 10 years ahead of the practice.
Well, yes, I get all of that. So that's I think that makes perfect sense. The health tech industry, again, if you're going to build next generation healthcare, you're going to be doing it on data science.
Yeah.
And if as the economy improves across Africa, with investment and so forth, they're going to want to improve the quality of lives of their citizens, and it's going to get cheaper to do that compared to sort of healthcare we saw during the 80s and 90s, in particular, how the costs just kept piling up. And think about all the new tools we're going to have for that. In terms of the biotech stuff, what in particular, where do you see centers of excellence or investment popping up on Africa for specific investment in those areas?
Now, the investments are modest,
Okay.
against the size of the population. Having said that, we're working very closely with a company called Aspen Pharmacare. It's the ninth largest generics manufacturer in the world. And we're doing this work through the Center for African Management and Markets that you referenced earlier. And our mandate through the center is to help Aspen find scalable businesses that bring new solutions, whether it's, and here, interestingly, although you're referencing AI and, the future technologies, Aspen Pharmacare's mandate says they don't mind whether they're working in first, second, third, or fourth industrial revolution. What they're looking for is solutions that are built for African problems, not
Mm.
necessarily in Africa, but for Africa, and maybe not even by Africans, but solutions that are resident for African problems.
Now, what a lot of people probably don't realize, and you wrote about this last year, is that when we talk about BRICS, we're also talking about Africa, the BRICS alliance, right? Can you
Yeah,
explain why that is?
well, the BRICS alliance, I think, completely recasts the global stage. That a BRIC collective represents the majority of world population, the majority of world reserves. Most of the world's land mass is represented by BRICS, and it's not BRICS, but it's the expanded BRICS.
Yes,
My
right.
my
This is what
bad
we're
dad
saying.
joke about this.
Yes, you
Yeah.
you you you
My,
made that joke about the S stands for South Africa, but but
no,
but
no,
it
no. I've
is
got a better bad joke. My better
okay.
bad joke is
What's
there's bricks and cement. And
oh
cement is countries and emerging markets that are excluded by new terminology. That's the acronym.
right, okay.
And
I like that.
so yeah, I thought it was cool. And that collective have two things in common. The first thing that they have in common is they represent all of these majorities that I've referenced loosely. But the second thing that they have in common is they are not Western models. They are not
Yeah.
Washington consensus.
No, but I mean, but this is what I'm talking about is not a lot of people understand that South Africa actually joined the BRICS alliance. It's not a joke in 2010, right? This
Yeah,
happened in the
yeah,
past. So it's like
yeah.
there's a clear gateway to between China and and Africa now, at least, but the other BRIC nations. And so when we start talking about the economics of BRIC nations, then there's definitely a clear African angle to it, right?
There's a very clear angle to it, Brett. The challenge that you've got is, whether it's Nairobi, Lagos, or Johannesburg that you think is the port or the window to Africa. The challenge is being able to achieve connectivity.
Right.
And there's some big policy efforts, big policy endeavors. African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a great example of that, or a great illustrator of that. But we're talking about a region where it is a challenge to get from the words, the policy ideas to the action.
So what do you there's clear directionality in terms of particularly Russia and China. India's been a little more careful about talking about this, but in terms of Russia and China's intent to change the power of the US dollar from trade, but particularly because of fear of sanctions and so forth. So you have the yuan as a cross-border potential, digital cross-border CBDC that's emerging. But I mean, how do you think something like that could work in, say, 10 or 15 years?
I think that that's worth giving very serious consideration to. This is a show about the future, where people think, and peer decades ahead. There's a lovely quote from Winston Churchill, where he says or suggests, the further you look back, the further you can look forward. In your observation, I'm reminded of the fact that there is no currency that's dominated for more than a century. So it would look, we don't have more than a few centuries of modern financial and economic history, but there is a whole bunch of things that point to the US dollar being vulnerable. As the currency of choice, the currency in command. And this isn't about, imagining that the US collapses. I'm not going there, but I think it would be.
We've done that on other shows, so don't get stressed about that.
All right. So, but I think it would be naive, to not imagine a world in which there is a new currency,
a challenger,
that emerges. A challenger currency. I like that term.
Well, if you think about it, right, because China is going to be the world's largest economy sometime, probably by the end of the second half of the 2030s, particularly with US national debt cliff and all of those sorts of things. Plus the fact that their GDP is just continuing to grow, despite all of the, the Bloombergs and Reuters talking about the collapse of the real estate, system and so forth, right? But so that's a clear potential, and then you've got India as well. And the top three economies of the world is going to be US, Russia, and India. So, that's a new reality. And
then you could throw into the mix, if you could get some regional African integration. Maybe not throwing in a single African country, but perhaps even an African region, East Africa being the obvious piece of the puzzle that I'd throw into the hat.
There's been attempts at African economic unions, though, hasn't
there? There have been attempts, and there's attempts in West Africa to bring about cohesion. East Africa is the newest, and I would venture making impressive strides. I'll go so far as to suggest that within the next 15 years, for the sake of a date, within the next 15 years, East Africa, including Ethiopia, Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, could be single currency and borderless.
Wow. That's a great prediction.
We'd love to have, starting to
that makes
Europeanize.
sense. Particularly with like digital passport tech and digital identity tech,
Exactly.
Borders don't really make as much sense as they used to.
But remember also, Brett, that the colonizers put up the borders.
The colonizers. You're right.
Put up the borders.
This is something. I mean, this is why. This is part of our global understanding, of course. But in Africa, it's obviously, I come from a colony, right? Australia. The colonizers. So, this is interesting because, China's not really a colonizer like we think of Britain or the French, which colonized plenty of Africa, the Dutch, not really a colonizer in that perspective. It's more like economic colonization, right? How does that change the culture of Africa over the next 30 years? Let's get into the future, the far future stuff.
Sure. You want to go 30 years out from there? So I think we need to be careful. Let's start all the way back at the beginning. Africa isn't a place. And, what we see is some particular markets, economies in Africa that are set up for strong structural growth. Cases in point, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, in West Africa, in East Africa, Rwanda, Kenya, Ethiopia, in Southern Africa, Namibia, Zambia, set up for 4, 5, 6% sustainable economic growth. Not all of them large populations, but some of them, big populations. Ethiopia, Tanzania being good cases in point. Not only then are these much bigger economies starting to emerge into middle income status, but they will emerge there with infrastructural investment and with young growing populations, which is a massive void that the advanced world is staring at, but I don't think that they've really got their head around it. So
yeah, I agree.
To me, one of the big challenges of the next 20 years is where will the young people come from that help developed advanced economies sustain themselves? It's not their home markets. They have to integrate.
But this is, I mean, this is a problem the globe is going to be facing. Look at the way immigration is vilified right now.
Yeah.
And yet there's going to be plenty of people that are going to be quite happy to move to the African continent for quality of life, for access to food security. Emerging healthcare could be an issue. It could be something that attracts talent there. And, if you've got economies that are growing and demand for new tech and things like that, then, AI specialists and things like that may see it as Greenfield, so, and it might be a bit more interesting, a bit more exotic than, some of the usual destinations. There's all, potential reasons for why you might. And then the eco-refugees. Like, what if we decide as a planet to, we got 1 billion eco-refugees floating around the planet in 2050. Where are we going to put them? Well, we could put them in new cities in Africa, but it would require massive investment, from other parts of the world to do that. But I'm sure Africa it'd be a sort of a win-win, right?
Be a win-win. There's a piece of work that
there's a
we've been
cultural
doing.
impact of having immigration, but there's an economic impact that seems to be better, right?
Yeah. Look, keep in mind that the bulk of Africa is Anglophone and Francophone.
Right.
That immediately creates strong connections with large parts of the advanced world. We've only got one Spanish-speaking country. It's Equatorial Guinea. But the Spaniards can head off to Latin America. The the you raised two flags here. The one is a very obvious challenge from an African perspective, and that is the impact of climate. And the most vulnerable and least prepared region in the world is Africa. But the second is, if you just think of purchasing power, you can swap your apartment in New York, in Manhattan, for acres of farmland, or sea views, that are just magnificent. So there is.
So if you can work remotely, why wouldn't you go to Africa?
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
Especially if you're a digital nomad.
And there are some African economies that are making this a working reality. Kenya is a good example. Mauritius is another. And to some extent, whilst very, very small, Seychelles.
Yeah. All right. So let's wrap up because we're coming to the end of the show. But let me ask you about this. Talk to me about how the economy might change in 30 years. If we do have this global disruption, artificial intelligence, climate change, and so forth, and you can do it just from an African perspective, but how is that likely? How is this infusion of investment in infrastructure, the need to be highly sustainable but abundant energy because of the solar revolution? Throw all this into the mix, and how does it change the way we think about corporations and economics?
The corporation, of the past, if we use the archetype, has been a shareholder-dominated corporation. But if we look at the performance of businesses through a large part of our work in Boundless World has been trying to understand, distill the basic ingredients that translate into sustained company performance. And one of the enduring attributes is businesses where company and community are inextricably intertwined. I think that that is the corporation. First, I think it's the corporation of the past, but I think it is likely to be more obviously the corporation of the future. That there is raised awareness that the infrastructure, the historical infrastructure, is no longer relevant. AI makes a lot of it redundant. You've referenced remote, having and giving the necessary recognition to remote work. I would emphasize that we are gregarious creatures. We do like herding, we like hanging out, and so I think cities remain, a part of that future economy.
I think, I mean, cities will have to change, but I mean, I like going to see my friends, and I'm going to see them in cities. That's sort of really, I'm not going to trek out to the middle of the Amazon or the wilds of Kenya necessarily to see my friends, because it's a much bigger commitment, right? I don't know.
But we can do all types of fanciful things here, talking about, virtual realities, virtual tourism, even, virtual relationships, robotics, enter stage left. But, in this world of 20, 30 years time, we've also got, ongoing elevation in life expectancy, people living longer and longer. Healthcare becomes an increasingly important part, and I'd underline the care part of that.
Yes.
Not the pharmaceutical, the care part
No. I mean,
of healthcare.
health is a lifestyle, right?
Yeah. And then brand new businesses. Time Bank is a South African-born bank, which is doing unbelievable things. And I'm doing work with them in helping them think about what the future of banking looks like. I would venture that we don't need 20 or 30 years. I would venture that in the next 10 years, 7 of the 10 biggest banks in the world will be virtual.
All of the fastest growing FIs in the world are digital. That bar none. If you take a look at the top 50, and already statistically, I dropped this. This is research from my new book, but the top 20 fintechs have 4 billion customers, and the top 20 banks have 2.8 billion customers. It's already happened.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
In many ways.
That's what I suggested.
Not if you measure it by
Yeah.
Not if you measure it by assets under management or return on
that will
equity
change.
or asset size, but that's just not important in this digital-led future. That those metrics that you're using are just are not going to is not what's going to take you to the next level, right? So
where those new models can achieve ROEs of 40%.
Yeah, exactly. Or where we don't care as much about the ROE, right? Where we're saying it's a good community thing. It's helping the community. It's growing the community. It's advancing longevity. It's advancing the healthcare needs of a community. It's like think about new UBI models and stuff like that. There's lots of opportunities. Lots of.
Let's make up a new metric here. It's called RTHC, Return to Human Capital.
Ah, I like that. I like that. You heard it first on the Futurists. Return to human capital. All right. Well, Adrian, this has been great having you on the show. I appreciate you giving some time for us, and thanks to good plug to Time Bank who put us together. And if you're interested, check out the episode I just did with the CEO of Time Bank on the Breaking Banks channel. So check that out. But Adrian, if people want to sort of keep in touch with what you're doing personally, particularly in relation to Boundless World, how do they track you, or how do they keep in touch?
Easiest places to find me are on social and X, or formerly Twitter. Just my name is my handle, Adrian Saville. Same on LinkedIn. You'll find me there just by my name, Adrian Saville.
Early adopter. Yeah, that's good. All right. Well, thanks for being on the show, bro.
Thank you, Brett. Great to be with you.
And when I'm in Joburg next, I'm coming to Joburg later in the year, so we can catch up for a beer in person. I know you're quite sociable. You
I got a couple for you.
So. Okay, awesome. And I always, if you look at my books, if you're in Cape Town, I always have in there when I write at the cafe. Is it called Truth? the coffee shop? I
Yes,
think so.
yes, yes, yes.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
is.
So I've got them, I've got a few of the coffee shops that I've used in South Africa have appeared in my books and acknowledgements. But anyway, that's a little side thing. But Adrian, thanks for
I'll be
being on
sure to check it
Futurists.
out. Thank you, Brett. Great to be with you.
All right, that's it for this week's show. I hope you enjoyed it. Check out our back catalog of shows. If you're interested in economic stuff, check out the show we did with Yanis Varoufakis, the author of Techno-Feudalism and the book around Techno-Feudalism, and of course, others. So it's great. If you like the show, feel free to leave us a comment or two. Interact with us on social media. All of that helps generate new audience. And of course, my thanks to the team, particularly Elizabeth Severins and Kevin Hersham, who really make sure we get the show out every week, and Sylvie Johnson. So thanks to the team at Provoke that help us with that. But as you know, we'll be back next week. Until then, we'll see you in the future.